FilmFest report provides you with insights to anticipate the 2025 Film Festival season. Explore the dates of the world's major film festivals, including Cannes, Berlin, Sundance, Venice, Locarno, Hot Docs, IDFA, and many more. For more info, go to filmfestreports.com.
The Independent Film Choice Podcast.
This is the Independent Film Choice Podcast, hosted by the beautiful Angela Bell on iHEART Radio. And on today's show, a conversation with filmmaker Abassi Okoro.
Can I tell you how excited I am for this week's guest? I'm going to tell you guys right now that this brother is no joke. You're about to be taken on a ride to another world, another galaxy, the multiverse, if you will. If you look up the word critical thinker, you'll see this brother's picture right next to it. He is a filmmaker, director, writer. You might know his works from his 3 films that are streaming worldwide on Amazon Prime Video, Apple TV, Roku, Tubi, Fossum, Afroland TV, and in 13 international countries. He has Default. Beauty is in the eye of the colonizer, Uncloaked, the myth of post-racial America, and the film that changed my perspective on history, Theft of the Black Gods, which has a Rotten Tomatoes rating. He is the founder and CEO of AO Films and Orisha Light Productions. He is the author of over 290 articles on such topics as religion, politics, and social justice. And we are honored to have this very talented visionary on the show today. And we're going to get deep today, people. Hold on tight, everyone. Please welcome Abassi Okoro.
Man, now I'm looking around to see who's coming out. Thank you. Yeah, thank you for having me.
Well, we are honored to have you on the show, and welcome.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I was talking to my producer a few months ago and was literally begging him to watch Theft of the Black Gods. And I think both of us just had so many questions, and I just wanted to have this conversation with you. And so I took notes. So let me tell everyone that you're in the middle of writing the script for Theft of the Black Gods, the series.
Right.
And so we appreciate you so much for taking the time out to come on the show. I know writing never really stops for you.
Oh yeah. The writing never stops. It's always an ongoing process because, you're always pulling ideas from somewhere out of the multiverse, no matter where you are. And, case in point, I was just down in Orlando for vacation, and I took my little Android notebook, and I have this really cool and useful portable Bluetooth foldable keyboard. And I found myself writing on the train, and I'm writing at the resort, and I'm writing it in the hotel room.
I hope you got some actual vacation fun in.
Oh yeah, we did have some fun. We didn't go to Disney World, but we did have some time to relax.
Okay, so I am really excited for this series, Theft of the Black Gods Decoded. My question is, what is going to be different about this series compared to the film?
Well, for one, it's a series, and so that's the biggest difference.
Okay.
And I think the stories are more dynamic in terms of getting to the core of the characters. In the film, we did explore the character arcs, but it was really minimal compared to what we're doing with this series. But with the series, we can actually slow down a bit and really hone in on the psychology of the characters in a way that allows the viewers to really become invested and engaged in these characters. And I wanted to choose characters that were relatable to the average viewer.
Now, when you say you chose characters that are more relatable to the viewers, give us some of the characters you chose for this season.
Yeah, so our episodes revolve around characters like Anakin Skywalker, Thanos, Killmonger, the Joker, Agent Smith, the Horned Gods like Loki and Maleficent.
So they're all villains?
Yeah, and I chose these characters because I think human beings, in all of our flaws and wondrous shortcomings, we can relate to villains more than we can relate to heroes. Not that we can't do heroic deeds because we certainly can and we certainly do. But the vast majority of us typically hesitate when life calls for us to be heroic. We have what's called bystander effect, where we have passivity, we have reluctance, we have even conflict. We know we should act, right?
Right.
That's the reluctance. But we're often too shy, or we don't want to call attention to ourselves, and that's the passivity. And we think if we act, then we might get hurt or we might get into trouble ourselves, and that's where the conflict comes in. When you see a woman getting attacked by her boyfriend or husband or by some random, man on the street, how quick do we jump in to help her? Or do we even jump in at all? Right? Or do we keep it moving and don't get involved? It ain't any of my business. You know what I mean?
Yes.
We usually don't get involved, and the more people we see walk by and do nothing, that actually influences everyone else to keep walking.
That's true, but does that really make us a villain?
Not in the traditional sense, but it also doesn't make us a hero. A hero is defined by what they do instead of what they fail to do. What that makes us, more than anything, are bystanders. And the line between bystander and villain is really thinner than that of bystander and hero. And I think that's what makes the villain so relatable, because we recognize these faulty attributes in ourselves, and we recognize fear, we recognize reluctance and conflict.
I think there's a natural tendency for human beings to be heroic. I grew up in the church, and of course the teaching is that, we're all God's children, we're all in the light, and we become corrupted by evil.
Again, I'm not saying that we can't become more heroic. I think despite our best intentions, humanity, we still have this tendency to lean more towards the negative qualities that we possess. And that's why we have war and racism and sexism and homicide and political uprising and conflict. And we live in a society that facilitates these negative qualities, and we embrace these darker qualities in ourselves. You can hear it in our music. You can see it in our television programming. You see it in pop culture. You see it in politics. But what you don't see is a lot of heroism. This is why it's such a big deal in the news media, because either it doesn't happen very often or it's not reported very often. Even if it is the latter, it's not being reported because we don't want good news. We want drama. We want chaos.
Reminds me of the guy who climbed the high rise to save the baby from the burning building. And everyone was like, yo, he's the real life Spider-Man. Do you remember that?
Of course. But that's what I'm talking about. Heroic deeds go viral because that's the exception and not the norm. The norm is the homicides and the rapes and the war and the mass shootings, because that sells.
Right.
It produces more clicks on the internet.
So the series is really like a metaphor for our own negative traits.
It's a way for us to see ourselves by analyzing these characters, learning from their arc, understanding their motivations, and looking at their actions and asking, was it valid? Was it well-founded? Was it rational? Because valid and rational are not the same thing. I think with all the characters in this season, you'll find that their reasons for behaving the way that they do is valid, but the methods or the outcome may be irrational.
Gotcha.
And I think we're able to see a lot of that in ourselves.
So how many episodes are in this season?
So we have 6 episodes in a season, and each episode will focus on a particular character, and that character we will show the ancient origins, the mythologies, the syncretizations, which can be traced back to ancient time.
So which episode is your favorite?
I really like episode 2, which is called Finite, and it deals with the character Thanos.
Okay. And
his idea of wiping out half of the universe to preserve resources so that life can go on. To me, there are some really valid points coming out of that idea of overpopulation. But again, he's wiping out life in order to save life. So there's this type of, ethical dilemma. It's actually called the trolley problem or the runaway train problem.
That's a new one for me. I've never heard of that.
What it is an ethical experiment to measure a person's morality. And you can use just about any scenario to measure a person's moral and ethical compass, right? So the dilemma is that a runaway train is off course and it's about to collide with a large group of people, killing everyone, 20, 30 people. Let's say 20, 30 people. Now, the driver of the train has the choice to divert the train onto another track, which will only kill one person. So the question is, does he sacrifice one person in order to save 20 people?
You sacrifice the one person because that benefits the bigger number?
Right. Okay. Now, if we're talking about logic, that makes sense in terms of numbers, but we're not talking about logic. We're talking about morals.
I don't know. I would still have to go with killing the one guy.
Okay.
I think that's also a moral right for me.
What if we're talking about abortion? Isn't that what the whole abortion debate is about?
Right.
This person thinks abortion is logical in certain circumstances, while this person thinks it's immoral no matter what the circumstances. So now it comes down to the dilemma of acting versus not acting. And if you act one way, can you be held responsible for the deaths that you could have prevented?
Okay.
And on the flip side, if you act the other way, can you be held responsible for the one death that you did cause? So when you look into Thanos' intentions, his intentions are logical. They make all the quantitative sense. And his morals are even right because they're in the correct place, because he wants to do good by the universe. However, his actions are flawed. His politics are nihilistic, and his ethics, they really go against the greater community.
Gotcha. So you have an episode. Now, I gotta tell you, I don't know what you're gonna say, but it's about Killmonger. I love me some Killmonger. So what is going on with Killmonger?
Just like the Thanos character, there's a lot of complexities, a lot of valid ideas and emotions coming from this character, and especially dealing with his ancestral homeland, the death of his father at the hands of his blood relative, even his own people turning their backs on him and abandoning him. It's such a relatable narrative.
Listen, I was so irritated with T'Challa when he said he wasn't the king of all people, which we all know what that meant. He wasn't the king of black people. That's when I was like, Lord. How did you feel about the Black Panther film?
The one thing about the film Black Panther that I found was a little disappointing, and I did love the film, by the way, but the one thing that I think they could have done a little better with was that the film only really gave us two types of black people. They gave us the Boule, who were like the secret society of wealthy Negroes, the Wakandans, only concerned about themselves. And then they gave us the militant blacks, who mean well, but the methods are misplaced. And if you notice, the only group with a neutral representation were the women,
right?
Like Nakia, who had the philosophy that, yes, you can be the powerful Wakandan empire, but you can also help other black people around the world. And we all know throughout the film that Black Panther, T'Challa's character, wasn't really feeling that, because that's how he was programmed by his father, to only care about his own people.
That makes sense. And you're writing a script for a future horror movie, is that correct?
Yeah, so it's a contemporary horror film. We're looking to film on location in West Africa, also here in the States, within the next, 3 or 4 years or so. We have not started scripting as of yet. We do, however, have a concept, we have a theme, and the film will be disturbing, I can tell you that.
Okay.
But disturbing for the purpose of it being thought-provoking and encouraging conversation over what is cultural appropriation and what is culturally appropriate.
Do you have a title?
Yeah, it'll be called The Burden.
The Burden.
Yes.
Okay. Now, why horror for your first fiction film?
Because it's a genre where you don't really see a lot of us dabbling in. I can really only name, I think, 3, maybe 4 filmmakers. Of course, you have Jordan Peele, Gerard McCurry, Nia DaCosta. And, that's really it for us in the horror game. But interesting enough, we saturate the Black comedy and the Black crime genre. And horror is one of those untapped categories, The horror demographics are typically white males between the age of 16 and 65, with the white male millennials being the main investors.
Right.
And, I believe horror is just such a powerful genre, and it's really one that, if done correctly, case in point, Jordan Peele with Get Out and the series Them, directed by Little Marvin. So if done correctly, it's a genre that Black filmmakers can really dominate in, because the narratives are based in racial trauma. And a lot of times those narratives make for the best storytelling.
Default.
Yes.
Loved it.
Thank you.
It was timely, and it's a topic that we take for granted. And Black women or women of color having to be on that negative side or the losing side of white beauty standards and white aesthetics. And one of the things that I absolutely loved about this film was that it was told from the perspective of a man. And I thought that was so pertinent, because so often it seems like when we as Black women speak up, our voices are muted, or our concerns aren't really taken into consideration, or we're told that we're complaining and those complaints don't have any real substance and blah, blah, blah. But when the same argument is mirrored by the male gender, it adds to the credibility,
Yeah, beauty standards by definition are biased, particularly if you're using the word standard. You can't standardize something that is as subjective as beauty. It's an absurd notion. And, as Black men, we're not lost to the idea that there are white beauty standards, and those beauty standards affect women of color. I have a perspective on that. And there's been a lot of criticism that as a man, maybe I shouldn't have a perspective on issues that affect women. I think one of the comments made about the film during my public screening was, well, it's still from a man's perspective. Well, no, it's not a perspective based on the fact that I'm a man. It's not a gender-based perspective. It's a perspective based on the system of racism and discrimination. And if that racism is against Black people, then regardless of the gender of the victim of that racism, as a member of the victimized group, I am in every way qualified to have a perspective on that racism.
Absolutely.
Also, I recognize the trauma that Black women go through when it comes to being told that, they're not pretty enough, or their nose is too broad, or their lips are too big, their hair is too nappy. Because my mother is Black. My grandmother was Black. My aunts, my sisters, my cousins, my daughters are Black. And I see what they go through just trying to fit into a society where, they have to compete with blonde hair and blue eyes and white skin. And white beauty standards also affect Black men. It affects how we look at women of color. And it affects how we treat certain women based on how we're programmed to perceive physical beauty.
That's right.
So it's really just as much my problem as it is a Black woman's problem, right? And I stand with any Black woman who pledges to fight against aesthetic racism.
Well, I greatly appreciate your perspective because it's spot on, and it's just refreshing to have a male perspective, because sometimes, you know, even though we know what we're saying because we've been saying it for damn generations, society can still gaslight you so damn hard that you start questioning yourself. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do. And there needs to be a united front against all types of racism. You know, we can't just start dividing out, you know, certain battles to specific subgroups to fight because of this, you know, this notion or this idea that it's their fight and not our fight. White beauty standards are not a battle just for women of color. White beauty standards are part of the larger motif of white supremacy. You understand what I'm saying?
Yes.
And it would be asinine for me as a black man to pretend that, you know, I don't have a say, or I don't, or at least I shouldn't have a perspective solely based on the fact that I'm a man.
Absolutely. Are we looking at a follow-up to Default?
Not at the moment, you know, but you never know. Maybe sometime in the future we'll, you know, revisit that topic.
Okay. Switching gears here. So there's this idea amongst us black folks that a black film or a black made film should be supported or endorsed by the greater black community solely because it's a black created film. And there's a sense of, I guess, pride, you can say, that comes with one of our own telling our story, right? Do you feel that all black films, regardless of how well they're made, deserves this massive support from the black community?
I think to answer that question, we have to really talk about this myth of racial loyalty, because that's really been a misnomer in the black community. This notion that, you know, we owe black people our obligation, or we should automatically practice loyalty based on, you know, shared ethnicity. And that might be the only thing we share is ethnicity. We might not share the same experiences or the same culture or the same spiritual beliefs or the same political ideology. And loyalty in regards to support or endorsement has to be driven. It really has to be driven by something other than skin color. I just think that as we go through this emergence of black culture and black identity, there's also this unfair expectation that everyone black should think and behave, you know, as a collective. We tend to support what we like, you know, what we believe in. It's personal and it's individualistic. Now, there are some black groups that I will support and endorse, and there are some that I won't, because I don't vibe, you know, with their mission or their actions. Not that there's something nefarious about it, but we tend to pick and choose who and what we support. And that's my personal choice. And it really has nothing to do with it being black. Now, as far as pledging my loyalty to anything just because it's black or black theme, you know, we have to be more critical, and we have to think more critical at this point. For us, by us, isn't always good for us, and it's gaslighting. And the common response is that if you don't support a black enterprise, then by default, you're supporting a white enterprise, right? Some black films are simply unwatchable. And that observation is a critique of quality and proficiency and skill level and knowledge. It's not a critique of ethnicity. So we have to get out of this mindset that if another black person doesn't appreciate the output of another black person's product or skill or whatever, then it must be because they're not a true black person, or they're turning their back on the black race. We have to get out of that mindset.
We see a lot of that in our communities, this sort of guilt trip for not supporting black projects, not because they're black, but because maybe you don't want to invest in that particular project for whatever reason.
Yeah, and I think it has a lot to do with our own implicit bias. And I think people need to ask what it means to be biased against other black people, because that's what it is when you build resentment towards other black people for not behaving in a manner that you deem as acceptable black. I've had people try to convince me to invest in something while using my ethnicity as the selling point. You know what I mean? Now, of course, the argument can be made that that's what a target group is, but a target group has more than one qualifying factor, and typically it doesn't gaslight you, on the tail end by saying how you're not black enough if you don't invest in this product.
Exactly. I mean, even President Biden said that if you have a problem figuring out who to vote for, me or Trump, then you ain't black, right? Which was ridiculous because as an old white guy, he's the last person to qualify who is black and who isn't.
Right, but it's not just him, right? There's this almost ethnic arrogance that people who are not part of your ethnic group have that makes them feel empowered and controlling, but more importantly, qualified to qualify you as a whatever, and black people do it to one another as well. We would like to think that, black people can't be racist and, and this is a belief that has gone around for decades that black people can't be racist. Well, not only can black people be racist, we are often racist and more racist against other black people. So the ability to hide overt racism doesn't mean that we aren't racist. It simply means that we don't have the resources to turn our racial bias into a global systemic structure. That, however, doesn't mean that we don't have racial bias.
Why don't white people go to see black films?
I think initially it was just a lack of interest, right? And I know that sounds like a basic, unfulfilling answer, but, let's just think about it for a second. You have black stories that are completely unrelatable to a white audience because most black movies are made specifically for black people, from the language to the culture to the aesthetics. And white people really lack the threshold of empathy necessary to identify with black characters, which affects their ability to suspend disbelief. And when you're watching a movie, you have to surrender yourself to the narrative. And in my experience, there are a lot of white folks who just aren't ready to surrender themselves to a black narrative because in doing that, there's guilt. And because of this, oftentimes white people will feel more uncomfortable watching a slave movie than a black person. And I'm like, what are you so uncomfortable about? Right? I remember clearly after the original Roots miniseries came out, white people were apologizing, profusely apologizing. And one girl said to me how sorry she was after watching Roots. And so that type of reaction may present itself as empathy, but it's really guilt and shame.
So just to be clear, the racial empathy gap doesn't mean that the person is racist. It just means that there's a certain comfort level when it comes to being around certain people. Is that correct?
That's correct. There's no real hard correlation between lack of empathy and racist attitudes. Now, they look similar at times, but more often than not, whites simply don't take notice of black people because, let's face it, they don't have to, right? It's like I can walk into, as a black person,
okay,
I can walk into a crowded room.
Yeah.
And within 5 seconds, I can locate the one other black person in that room. And I know what it means for the both of us to find one another. Now, white people can also experience exclusion, but when a white person walks into a crowded room and there's no white people there or one white person there, it means something different for them. For us, we'll make the best of the situation. A white person notices that he or she is the only white person in the room, they'll immediately leave.
Now, that is interesting because I've been in spaces where there's a majority black folks, right? And maybe there's just one white person. But if he's there, then that means that he is really comfortable there and he's having a great time and the black people love him. You know, it's like, okay, this guy is invited to the cookout type situation. You know what I mean? But if a black person is in that same situation, but the majority white people, and he's treated, you know, in the same manner, he's having a good time, he's loved by the people, he's smiling, then we question the loyalty of that black person. Now he's an Uncle Tom.
Yeah, and I think that's indicative of our attitudes towards race. Black Americans spend a great deal of time manipulating other Black Americans, and we do it 100% to undermine other people's experiences, and it's very deliberate.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we know that white folks tend to feel safer around groups of black people than black people feel around groups of whites. And this is also evident in the film industry and other industries as well.
What are some of the problems that you see in black films?
I think the most obvious problem that I see, and of course someone else can see it, you know, completely different, but it's the problem of failing to represent all aspects of the black experience. Because black films tend to fall into only three major categories: Jim Crow era films, hood or gangster movies, and struggle films or dysfunctional family, dysfunctional relationship films. I would even propose that there's a fourth category that has a little of the other three kind of, you know, mixed in, making it this sort of strange kind of gumbo category. Tyler Perry films will often fall into this fourth hybrid category where you really can't apply the film to a specific genre because, yeah, I mean, most of the time it's just all over the place, you know. You don't know if it's a drama, you don't know if it's a romantic comedy, a thriller, a religious film. And this isn't a knock on Tyler Perry as a human being, but his writing seems extremely disoriented. And it usually follows the same formula for every film. So that's the big one for me, is this kind of confusing and misleading representation of black people. Another problem is that black films are one-dimensional outside of the black community. And I understand why we make films just for us, but that really stifles creativity. It doesn't push us to be competitive, and it limits us to the same narratives over and over.
Can you explain a little more what one-dimensional outside of the black community mean?
It means that as black artists, as black creators, we have to be able to penetrate, you know, large media. Black films have for many years been, you know, sort of trapped in this fishbowl. And the fishbowl itself is inside of a larger body of water. So we don't make films that have a lot of crossover appeal. And if you want global exposure and you want that mass appeal, then we have to think about our films having a wide scale impact and not just having, you know, an impact in the black community.
And what does that look like from a production standpoint?
From a production standpoint, it involves a wider range of perspectives from, you know, what we're used to getting, which is just, you know, I call it modern day blaxploitation films. We have to define new and innovative and inclusive narratives. And I think using the film platform for social protests and to tell black history is great. However, that shouldn't be at the expense of having a creative eye and telling new stories. We can root our stories in reality while at the same time honoring our plight and our legacy and not trivializing and not sensationalizing, you know, our positioning in society. Hollywood already undervalues black films and it undervalues black talent. So you have to consider that every stereotypical black film that gets released by a black filmmaker who just wants to put out a race-related film is actually building the case against black films and against black filmmakers for why we're being undervalued, which translates to being underfunded. Now, from a distribution standpoint, we can choose distribution companies that have, a work history with a diverse client base and working with international markets and international buyers.
Okay, so if this is the case, then how does this change if these projects are consistently underfunded and undervalued?
I think black filmmakers need to dabble in other genres of filmmaking, like sci-fi, like, fantasy, speculative fiction, mystery, horror. These are genres that we typically stay away from, mainly because we never really saw ourselves in those types of films, or at least had a prevalent role in those genres. And it is changing slowly because you had John Bodega as one of the leads in Star Wars, but it's been nothing significant, unless it's a civil rights film or, a black trauma film or slave narrative or a minstrel comedy film, we weren't in Harry Potter. We weren't in Lord of the Rings. We weren't in Dune. We're not really in a lot of futuristic sci-fi movies. We're starting to get sprinkled around here and there, but it's really going to take some responsibility on our part. And it's not really up to Hollywood to cut us a break or give us better representation. We have to do that for ourselves. And how we do that is by changing our mindset and experimenting in this pool of different narratives and different genres.
Do you see that interest in black fantasy and black science fiction films?
I do.
Oh, okay.
But the viewing audience has to let independent filmmakers know what kind of films they'd like to see, because there's a partnership there. The thing about independent filmmakers that is contrastly different than filmmakers in major film studios is that as an independent filmmaker, your partner, your investor is the viewing audience. And especially if you're crowdfunding your project, your viewers are your investors, and they're empowered to say, hey, we would like to see a movie about so-and-so and such, right?
Right.
Whereas a major Hollywood studio have corporate investors who invest millions, and oftentimes more than we would like to believe, they will use their investment as leverage against a filmmaker's creativity. So if your investors, because they get to screen the film before anyone else, if your investors want a particular scene taken out of the film, either you take it out or call for a reshoot, or they will pull their investment, and these films are pre-budgeted. Okay? In the independent world of filmmaking, that doesn't happen. Crowdfunded projects are donations. And the whole reason for crowdfunding is, one, to avoid that type of political red tape, and two, to make sure your ideas are made reality. So if you want to see better representation of black talent and black films with black directors, then you have to invest in black cinema. Simple as that.
Okay. Before we go, I want to play word association. Is that cool?
Okay.
Ready?
All right.
Netflix.
Better options.
Dead presidents.
Underrated movie.
Black comedies.
Stereotypical.
Chadwick Boseman.
Oh, man. A Star.
P. Diddy.
Guilty.
Tyler Perry.
Avoid.
Denzel.
The GOAT.
Okay, last one, Lupita.
Perfect.
Oh, wait. Let's do one more. Can we do one more?
Are you asking me?
No, I'm asking my producer. Do we have time to do one more?
Yeah, of course we have time for one more.
Okay, this is the last one, I promise. Theft of the Black Gods.
Fire. Of course. Fire.
Well, thank you so much for coming on to the show and for taking the time out to talk to us today.
Thank you.
And please, everyone, run, don't walk. I literally want you to run and watch the film Theft of the Black Gods, now streaming on Amazon Prime and Roku and Tubi and Apple TV and all over the damn planet. And also check out the documentary. Default. Beauty is in the Eye of the Colonizer, which is also streaming on Amazon Prime and Tubi and is amazing. Theft of the Black Gods Decoded, coming in 2025. 6 episodes, and you can find more information on okorofilms.com, Facebook, and Instagram. I'm Angela Bell. This is the Independent Filmmakers Choice Podcast. We out. See ya.
Discover the magic of AO Films, the new era of cinedocs and filmmaking. okorofilms.com.